as the terrifying skeletal entity rushed up towards Talion. Him still unable to move, his legs shaking in place. The creature reeled back, swinging the back of one of its large arms directly into Talion. He was so scared, he couldn't even try to defend himself. As it hit, it sent him flying. The impact was immense, taking Talion completely off of his feet. He went hurtling like a bullet through the air. All Talion could feel was the pain of the impact, the rush of the wind as he flew through the air, and gasped for a moment's breath, seeing the ground rush by below him and slowly beginning to draw closer as he finally hit it, bouncing several times before rolling to a stop in the grass. The creature had hit him so hard, he had flew more than 60 feet. Talion's arm and rib cage were on fire. Talion had been hurt before, slipped and fell from high places, fallen out of trees onto rocks, and it did sting, but he was always just fine. Even if he fell from 30 or 40 feet up, the impact of the fall didn't really bother him all that much. Like stubbing your toe. Just a few moments of, ow, that hurt, and it was over. But the hit given to him by this entity was not a slight pain. He was racked with it. He had never been in so much pain in his life. As he tried to pull himself up, he could still hear that terrifying, ghoulish creature screeching. As he looked up in the distance, he could still barely make it out through the fog. It seemed to be writhing and flailing about as if it was going mad, even clawing and tearing at itself. The skeletal entity appeared to be dead. No more than blackened bones covered in ooze, and yet inside of it, he could see what looked like organs jostling and moving around, pulsating directly through the blackened ribs as the creature finally stopped flailing to glare over at him, hungrily opening its jaw and whipping around that long, blackened tongue. The man said that he was a siren, that sirens just make illusions. But if it was an illusion, then how did it hit him? Talion thought to himself as he tried to pull himself up. I don't understand. What's going on? Talion said. How can it hurt me? It's not real, is it? Of course it's not, he heard a voice announce from behind him, turning to see his teacher standing there. But whether it's real or not doesn't really matter if it can hurt you. I know I told you about the abilities of sirens, that we create illusions, and I was 100% truthful on that matter. Most sirens are incapable of creating any illusion that could actually hurt someone. It's simply a projection in the fog, something that you might be able to see or hear, but that can't actually touch you. But that is with weak, low-level sirens, ones that haven't accumulated the level of strength that I have. I think you'll find that the illusions that I make feel all too real, Talion. So if you are clinging to the hope that it might be scary, but there's no real danger, I'm afraid you're wrong. The danger that my illusions present is all too real. Shaking in your boots isn't going to get you out of it. Remember, the objective of this training is to surmount your fear. It's the most important thing. Nothing else even comes close to it when it comes to combat. I can teach you all the techniques in the world, how to master your abilities, gain destructive power like you've never imagined. But it's all useless if the moment something scary comes along, you freeze in place, waiting for it to gobble you down. The choice is yours, Talion. Conquer your fear, or be consumed by it, he said, as another gust of wind whipped by, the fog around him thickening as he seemed to disappear into nowhere, fading into nothing, evaporating away, as if he was never there to begin with. At that point, Talion heard another of those shrieks, that high-pitched cry that was deafening, hurting his ears. As he looked back, he saw the skeletal entity still tearing at itself. It actually reached into itself, grabbing hold of one of its ribs, ripping it out of its chest. He could hear the snapping of its bones as it did. For a moment, it simply stared down at the bone in its hand, as if it couldn't really understand what it was, before angrily clasping the bone and then smashing it into the ground. With a single thrust, the point of the bone digging into the dirt, after which the creature released its grasp on it. The bone just sitting there, jutting from the ground, and then something truly terrifying began to occur. From the bone jutting in the ground, it began to grow like a sickly black tree, rapidly sprouting new branches made of bone and black ooze, all the while giving off that same sickening sound of cracking bone as it grew ever larger. As it did, the bones beginning to snap over themselves, seeming to attach and overlap in different places, and in only a few moments, Talion could see a new form beginning to emerge from it. The snapping, twisting, and contorting bones beginning to form a shape. Arms, legs, a skeletal head. It was another one. That little bone was turning into another one of them, like it just decided to plant a bone and grow a copy of itself. In only a few moments, this duplicate was fully formed, pulling its last little bone from the ground as the shape solidified into another one of those things, still writhing, giving off that high-pitched screech, and beginning to look in Talion's direction, and starting to move. They were coming closer, at first very slowly, but the closer they got, the faster they started to move, beginning to lunge at him, dashing with great speed, clambering over one another, as if they were fighting to see who could get to him first. Talion had only managed to just get up, and he was still terrified, but his legs had finally stopped shaking, so he did the only thing that he could think of to do. He started to run. He dashed the opposite way, trying to get as far away from the creatures as he could. They gave chase, running after him. He needed to get away from them. They were very big. Maybe, he thought, if he could get to the woods, they might have a hard time moving around in there. He could be safe from them. He was much faster than any ordinary person. A cramped place with his speed might let him get away from them, or at least that's what he thought. As he took off, running in the direction of the nearest woods, he still had enough bearing to know what direction they were, from where he was standing originally. But despite their size and their horrendous form, the creatures following them were not slow. They seemed to be keeping pace with him. He was running as fast as he could, but he wasn't gaining any distance on them. Finally, Talion began to see the woods in the distance in front of him. He was almost there. This was a very thick part of the woods. Lots of small trees. There's no way those things could get through here quickly, he thought to himself as he finally broke through the tree line, dashing into the woods. He made it a ways in before turning back to see where the creatures were at, whether the trees were slowing them down, As he turned around, the creatures were just approaching the woods. Trying to get through, they quickly became lodged, stuck in more than one place, trying to squeeze their way through the small tree gaps and failing miserably. For a moment, Talion felt relieved. He was right. They couldn't get through the trees, but that only increased his terror and disappointment when suddenly the creatures seemed to simply stop trying to push their way through. In the moment they stopped, Talion was confused for a moment. What were they doing? They were just sitting there, and then their bones began to rattle, clanking against one another, vibrating as they sat there lodged in between the small tree gaps. And then, in a flurry of black shadow and bone, two sickening cracks rang out as the creatures seemed to explode, sending fragments of bone, blackened and shattered everywhere. For a moment, Talion wondered if it was over. Was that it? Was that all there was to it? That was, until all of the countless fragments of bone began to move, shaking in place, each small fragment starting to sprout little segments of bone out of it. And just like that, all of those tiny fragments began to create tiny little duplicates. They were much smaller than the original, but still held the same shape. But now, there were dozens of them, scattered everywhere, that all began to rush in Talion's direction. And just like that, the chase was back on.